Okay, you want the bad news, short and sweet, without pulling punches? Okay, we here in America do not have a system of taxation today. What we have is a system of peonage debt service by allowance, believe it or not. Why do I say this? Because not one penny of the money withheld from your paychecks and not one penny of any of the money that you send in on a check with your return on April 15th, not one penny of those funds goes in the United States Treasury as required by law. Title 26, Section 7809 requires that every penny collected as tax be deposited into the United States Treasury on a daily basis. Now, regulations modify that deposit requirement to weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly, and most employers send their withheld taxes in on a quarterly basis. So on January 1st, after the final day of the year, you should be able to call the Treasury and ask them how much credit for tax paid has been paid under my name and account number, the Social Security number, based on all of the money that's been withheld from my paycheck all year long. Your employer told you he had to collect it. They told you it was tax. He took it out of your paycheck, and the law 7809 says he has to send it to the Treasury on a quarterly basis. So shortly after the end of the year, December 31st, the end of the final quarter in the year, the money should be sent in, and at that point you should be able to call the Treasury and they should be able to tell you, yes, we have a record here of X $1,000 of tax being paid into the Treasury by your employer under your account and name. But if you call the Treasury, what do they tell you? They tell you there's no record of any deposit of any tax at all under your name and account number based on what your employer took from your pay all year long. Well, now, wait a minute. The law says he has to deposit it. He took it, told me it was tax, and we know he sent it in. So somewhere between the employer sending it and the Treasury, the money's being intercepted and rerouted to some other destination. Obviously, right? They took the money, your employer sent it in, it's not in the Treasury. So where did it go? Where did it go? You want to know where it went? I'll tell you how you can find out where it went. All you have to do is get from your bank a copy, both sides, front and back, of the last check you sent in with your Form 1040 to the IRS. Get that check from your bank and look at what it says. Now, how do you tell what's really going on? Do you listen to what they say? No, you don't listen to what they say. You follow the money. How do you follow the money on a check that you wrote? Well, you can look at the front of it where it says paid to Internal Revenue Service or United States Treasury, whatever you wrote on it. But again, you don't listen to what they say. That's just what they told you to write on it. If you want to know what's really going on, you got to follow the money. And the way you do that is you turn the check over and you see what it says on the back where it was endorsed by the recipient of the funds who cashed the check. If it was tax that went to the United States Treasury, it will say on the back of the check in the endorsement, deposit to the U.S. Treasury. But guess what? That's not what it says. Can you guess what it says? What it says is pay to any FRB, Federal Reserve Bank. Pay to any Federal Reserve Bank. Wait a minute. I thought the Federal Reserve Bank was a private corporation. Why is a private corporation cashing your so-called tax check when the law requires it to deposit it in the Treasury and taxes money for the government to spend? Congress? And of course, if it's not in the Treasury, Congress can't appropriate funds against it. So if an emergency comes up like a hurricane or a flood, Congress can't go to the Treasury and draw on existing tax revenues that have been accumulating all year because there are no revenues there. They're all over at the Federal Reserve Bank, being denied to the use of Congress. And what does that mean? That means that instead of spending the revenue that's already in the Treasury, they have to borrow more money from the Federal Reserve Bank. $34 trillion and counting so far. Because they can't get to tax revenue because there isn't any. It's not a system of taxation. The reason why the private corporation is the recipient of your so-called tax dollars, both when they are withheld from your check and when they are sent into the government on April 15th, is because it's not a system of taxation, it's a system of peonage debt service. Your government owes $34 trillion to the Federal Reserve Bank. The bank wants that debt collateralized, and you, the population of America, have been reduced to the roles of peons and serfs whose only job is to service the debts owed by the master on the hill to his private bankers. This is the 11th century plantation peonage system of involuntary servitude, where every peon and the serfs, the population, is given a little plot of land, i.e. your job, on the plantation run by the master on the hill, i.e. the United States. And all the serfs and peons are allowed to work their little plot of land all year long. But come harvest time, the master comes around and tells them how much of their annual produce and harvest they have to turn over to the master. And the peons get no say and how much is demanded or how much they have to turn over. It varies from year to year. They get no say on how the money is spent. And the master takes the money from the peons and uses it to pay his gambling buddies, his business buddies, his whores, his prostitutes, his court, and his munitions suppliers, and the king, of course. So the plantation has become the United States. The master on the hill has become the master on Capitol Hill, your government, which is taking your money from your labor and feeding it to the Federal Reserve Bank illegally and unconstitutional in a criminal system of racketeering that redirects so-called tax to the Federal Reserve Bank for the benefit of the private corporation. And as long as the majority of the American people continue to allow this system to be used to collateralize the debt, the bankers will continue lending in this unconstitutional system of enslavement. And what's really appalling is that Americans are deceived into asking for this, because your employer could not withhold tax that isn't due from you until next year on April 15th. He couldn't force you to pay that tax before it's legally due unless you gave him permission to collect it beforehand. To force you to service that possible future obligation of tax before it actually is a legal obligation would be to impose a condition of involuntary servitude, which is prohibited by the 13th Amendment. So they have to get your permission to collect it from you at work. And how do they do that? Well, they've got the whole society believing that you have to do it. You have to pay it early. You have to let them take it. There's a tax imposed. There isn't. There's no tax imposed on your right to work, and we're going to get to that later in other videos. But they're able to do it because you sign a W-4, an employee's withholding allowance certificate. That's not an allowance as in here's $1.50 to walk the dog and take the trash out every week that your parents gave you. This is allowances and your permission to do it. Employees withholding allowance certificate. You're allowing the withholding. You're asking them to take it. Why are you asking them to take money out of your check when you don't owe any tax until next year on April 15th? Aren't times hard enough now for you to need and want your whole paycheck? And then the employer sends the money in. He doesn't know what's going on. He's just doing what you asked. You gave him a voluntary request to withhold money. You shouldn't have checked single and zero. You should have written exempt. Should have written exempt. You're exempt. You have no liability for tax under Subtitle A this year or last year. And that's what Code Section 3402N says is required for you to claim exempt. And when you claim exempt, your employer is prohibited by that code section from withholding any income tax at all. So they've lied to you about the so-called requirement. It's not a requirement. It's an allowance certificate. It says so right at the top of it. They need your permission to force you to pay a tax before it's actually due next year on April 15th. It ain't due till then. You don't have to pay it when you get paid. Why are you letting them steal 50% of your paycheck? 30%. You need to pay. Claim exempt. The money taken out of your pay doesn't go to the Treasury as required by law under Section 7809, Title 26. Instead, it goes to the Federal Reserve Bank to collateralize the $34 trillion worth of debt that's ever growing and will continue to ever grow because there are no revenues in the Treasury for the government to ever tap to use to address an emergency outside of the budget. The money all goes to the Federal Reserve Bank. And the bankers don't give it to the government. They only lend to the government. So this isn't a system of taxation because if it were taxation, it would be going in the Treasury for government to spend. It's a system of peonage debt service. Involuntary servitude by voluntary allowance. Because, of course, if you claim exempt, the government tries to disallow the claim. Because you're their slave and peon and serf. Your only job is to service their $34 trillion in debt so they can continue to run up more. It's the peonage plantation system from the 11th century. It's not a constitutional system of taxation. And all the money you send in on April 15th with your return, none of that goes in the Treasury either. That's where it says on the back of the check, pay to any FRB. That money's all being routed to the Federal Reserve Bank too. So what's happening is on April 15th when you file, you're being a credit for tax. You're being given a credit for tax based on all of the involuntary debt service you performed for the course of the whole year. But you're not actually paying any tax because there's no tax imposed on your labor or your work. There was no tax imposed on your labor or work as a citizen in one of the 50 states from 1913 to 1942. In 1942, they started the victory tax, a temporary 2-year war measure, which let the government tax your labor for the first time in history. It was unconstitutional, but nobody objected. They got away with it. The war measure, any law or revenue mechanism that funds a war can only last for 2 years. It has to be reenacted by each successive Congress. So that if the American people don't want to be in the war, all they got to do is vote a Congress that will end the war by not funding it. And bang, it's over in 2 years. Now, any war revenue measure has to be renewed every 2 years. When the victory tax expired at the end of 44, the war was over. In 45, the war ended. They didn't need another measure, and they couldn't pass it. They wouldn't be able to justify it, and they wouldn't have gotten it through. But they looked around and said, my goodness, we just paid off all of the World War II debt in 2 years. We can't let this taxing power die. So they reenacted what's called the Current Tax Withholding Act, which is actually the subtitle C tax code today. That's chapters 21 through 25 of Title 26. It's the employment tax laws, the Social Security two-part tax, the unemployment tax, and the withholding of income tax. And in every single one of those chapters, there's a tax imposed. For the Social Security tax, there's a tax imposed, half on the employer, half on the employee. For the unemployment tax, there's a tax imposed on the employer. For the railroad tax, there's a tax imposed on the employer and half on the employee. And you get to the income tax chapter, chapter 24, and unlike all the other chapters and subchapters of subtitle C, the first code section is tax imposed, but in chapter 24, the first code section is definitions. Where's the tax imposed for this chapter? Collection of the tax, the income tax, at the source, i.e. from your pay. There isn't one. They let you assume that the tax in 1913 is imposed on you, even though it wasn't imposed until World War II, wasn't collected from you, and can't be shown from the original statutes and legislation to be imposed. So they let you assume there's a tax imposed on your right to work. There isn't. And then they give you a withholding certificate and tell you to claim single and zero or married and whatever, and that automatically triggers a level of withholding of the income tax, which makes you voluntarily subject to the withholding and collection of a tax that's not imposed on you and that you don't owe. And you become subject to it only by presumption. And then you are controlled for the rest of your life by that presumption. For the rest of your life, they're taking more than is owed, forcing you to file and give up your Fourth Amendment and Fifth Amendment rights to be secure in your person, papers, houses, and effects, and to not provide any testimony that will be used against you in a court of law. All of that's gone. You got to make full disclosure in order to get a refund. And once you're trained to file to get the refund, you spend the rest of your life as a serf, a peon, an indentured servant owned by the government who exists only to service their debt and to struggle to get by on the meager amounts they leave you with, resulting in the wife having to go to work, the kids being raised by the state, and the family still not having enough money to get by. It's not constitutional. It's not legal. It doesn't exist in the law. It's all exposed at www.tax-freedom.com, and I'm going to be producing a lot more videos showing you what is in the law and why this is a fraud. Not a system of taxation, but one of unconstitutional involuntary servitude and peonage debt service that has the entire country acting as indentured servants and peons to the Federal Reserve Bank.